Hi friends. Okay, let's try this again. I did this last time, and there was a problem with the audio, so I have to make it again. I'm going to probably try to make it a little quicker this time, or go through it quicker, and just get to the highlights here. So this lady, Evelyn S. She really keeps me honest, and is somebody whom I really appreciate, because she plays fair. She accepts the fact that at least some of the critiques I'm making are absolutely spot on, and that they're legitimate, and yet she's hesitant to attach any boat to any person, obviously, which is smart. She wants to make sure that I'm being honest in my argumentational dealings here. I want to stress that I am, and let me demonstrate that by being honest about it all, and exactly what my position is, exactly where I stand in terms of evolution and why. So let's read these comments first. Are you negating everything about evolution, or just the proposed mechanism? I think your critique of the mechanism is valid, but I don't see why all of evolution has to be bullshit just because we don't understand how it works. Between the fact that all organisms are genetically related and the apparently branching fossil record, why is our framing our understanding of human behavior in the frame of evolution wrong bullshit? Excellent question. Excellent question. Thank you for asking it. I appreciate it a great deal. My answer was, it's the central claim of evolution, as distinct from genetic malleability within a species, that's bogus. It doesn't explain what it purports to explain. I don't dispute genetics, obviously. It's bullshit because it gives us a false sense that we've answered the most fundamental questions, why we are here, or how we came to be as we are, in a fashion such that smart people ought to accept it as a meaningful explanation. She says, okay, I agree it's not a full map, but I can see why it would be offensive to you to claim it is a full map and sell it from a place of authority. Is that a correct interpretation of what you're saying? Not really, because the answer here is, she says, I guess for me the branching fossils is enough to accept it as a partial map in which to frame the understanding of human physiology and to some degree behavior. See, part of my point is the evolutionary frame is nonsense. It's a rhetorical frame, because you'll note that it's just something that it goes, well, if something's beneficial, then it was selected for. If something is deleterious, then it's a byproduct. And if something is if something needs to be explained, like in that video I was watching about the skeptics yesterday, and they're like, well, don't we need to evolutionarily explain God? And the answer is, oh, well, it's a byproduct. It's like moths who commit suicide they have an evolutionary advantage to seeking light, but they don't have, but it doesn't serve them well when it comes to candles. Okay, so which attributes of mine have an evolutionary advantage? Do I have a beard because it kept me warmer in the winter? Then why don't women have beards? Or is it just a byproduct? And the fact that you can shift that as however you want and be equally right tells me the evolutionary frame is bullshit as the explanation for things. I watched a Jordan Peterson video where he said, why do people prefer red, the color red in advertising? Oh, well, it's because having a particular eye for colorful colors like red and orange and stuff gave you an advantage in finding fruit. Really? I mean, I guess it would give you an advantage finding ripe fruit, but wouldn't you actually have an advantage to finding the fruit earlier when it was green and letting it ripen in secret, saving all the food for yourself? Or if you're in a social group, wouldn't whoever found the fruit just gain added social benefits, which may include more reproduction, but which probably isn't going to make a difference in the gene pool? Let me go back to the beginning and explain why I'm having the problem with evolution that I'm having. First of all, remember that it began with a book called Origin of the Species. It explained speciation. We have a fossil record, and we have varieties of variants of a species in the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin studied them, the finches and all that sort of stuff. And the intuitive conclusion to draw is, species evolved from protoforms into more complex forms. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to draw. the thing is, Darwin started out with a mechanism of reproductive success, reproductive selection, or competitive selection, survival of the fittest. Except that would only potentially work even in the model that he presented, which was phyletic gradualism. Phyletic gradualism is the notion that we started off as a protospecies 4 billion years ago and slowly, over 4 billion years evolved into these different species. But the problem with that is there's been at least 5 extinction events. The last one about 60 million years ago. And probably a lot more than 5. So each of those times, supposedly, most of the complex organisms were destroyed, leaving us to basically start over. So in the 70s, they came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium, which states that most species spend most of their existence in this period of stasis, where their genome as a species doesn't change very much. The gene pool doesn't change very much. So there are just short periods of time when all this evolution happens really fast. But the problem is, punctuated equilibrium doesn't explain what makes it go so fast. Why does it go so fast? How does it go so fast? Scientists have more or less done away with selection as a meaningful component in evolution. One group of biologists attempted to do away with it more or less entirely with a neutral theory of genetics that says since almost all mutations are deleterious and only some of them are neutral or nearly neutral and almost 0 mutations ever are advantageous, then it must be this accumulation of neutral or nearly neutral mutations into the gene pool that spreads through a non-selective mechanism called genetic drift. And but then someone pointed out that the math on that is such that genetic drift can only work for populations of a maximum of 100 or so, and really less than that. And that the selection idea only works at all in very small populations, because if there's 10,000 birds and one bird is born with a massive advantage, it's still not going to come to predominate the species, the gene pool. There's just too many other regular birds for its genes to become predominant. So now you might point out somebody like Genghis Khan, whose genes are in like half the human population or something. But you'll note that same species. It's not that he was a mutant, he was just a particularly effective, brutal man, So, the branching fossils is very suggestive that humans emerged from more proto-simple organisms into more complex organisms, or all species did. Here's the other problem. Biologists nowadays don't want to define species as producing reproductively viable offspring. They say, well, look, I'd point out that in however many years we've been breeding dogs, we still can't speciate from a wolf. A Chihuahua will still produce a reproductively viable offspring with a wolf. So if in fact speciation occurs through differentiation, through selection of any sort, we've maximized that way more than nature could. So why can't we speciate dogs and wolves? Well, scientists will say, well, that's not how we define species anymore. Well, how do you define it? Well, we don't really. It's just sort of consensus. So if we found a Chihuahua skull in the forest and it was extinct, we would certainly conclude it was a distinct species from a wolf. Okay, but so how do you explain this occurrence where donkeys can't breed with horses and produce reproductively viable offspring because they're different species? What causes that phenomenon of distinction there? And there's no answer for it. There's no answer for any of the meaningful questions of how species emerged from proto-organisms into more complex organisms. The fact is that we can change a given species into different breeds over time only reinforces the fact that we can't change them into different species over time. So my point is simply this about evolution. I'm perfectly happy to accept that the evolutionary model, provided I get some actual explanation of things. Provide some claims that can be falsified, first of all, right? Evolution, at this point, as far as I can tell, wants to avoid providing claims that can be falsified. I keep saying, well, is it this or this or this or this or this? You know, give me something that can be falsified. If you're not making claims that can be falsified, then you're not doing science in any meaningful sense. So I agree with most of the component elements of evolution. Like, obviously, if we were to have the founder's effect, which suggests that a population gets winnowed down to like 2 individuals of a species and they go off and on their own and they start a new colony of that species, and that's one way in which species branch off from other species. Okay, but then if that were the case, remember that those 2 individuals of the species are examples of the species. And even if they're both mutants in some regard, how dramatically are they mutated? Are they dramatically mutated in one generation, just one birth, and now all of a sudden you're a different species? They can no longer produce reproductively viable offspring, or what? So you can try to avoid defining species. You can try to avoid being pinned down on any of the specifics. But anytime any part of the explanation is put to any scrutiny or test, it seems to fail. It's conceivable, believable, potentially, that species could evolve over 4 billion years to achieve the differentiation and complexity that they do. But it's not conceivable that they could in 40 million years, not even remotely close. After all, humans have been at least the same genome in general for at least 20,000 years, 25,000 years. 4 of those blocks of time equals 100,000 years. Changing 0 times 4 is still 0 change. 10 times that is 1,000,000 years. So we know we can track the speed of change over time within species over the last 10 or 20,000 years and go, okay, they haven't really changed at all. So that contributes to the punctuated equilibrium model, where species are mostly in stasis all the time. But then evolution needs to explain how and when it is that evolution gets turned on and turned off, because it doesn't in the current manifestation. If you want to affirm evolution and you want to beat me in this and convince me that evolution is real, then you're going to need to answer some significant questions. Something along the line of, first of all, do you affirm phyletic gradualism or do you affirm punctuated equilibrium? If the former, you're going to need to explain away the extinction events. If the latter, you're going to need to provide some answer for what is the thing that turns it on and off. If the former, you're going to need to explain why it would appear that species have been in stasis for at least 10,000 years. And if the latter, you're going to need to explain again what caused them to go into stasis. If you believe in the nearly neutral theory and genetic drift, that's fine, but you need to explain how species evolve over time after they reach a population of 100. If you go for reproductive selection, you're going to need to explain the fact that we can't speciate even if we maximize all the reproductive selection vectors by purposely breeding them in a way that nature never could, selecting for this trait or that trait. So the bottom line is, I absolutely accept that genetic drift occurs in populations as described, and that the drift barrier of about 100 individuals in the population, and it's really lower than that, is applicable and stops it from having an effect after a population reaches that size. I agree that most mutations are deleterious. I don't agree that this explains the genome, because what's the problem? If we were to take that model, the nearly neutral model, and it has some claims that can be falsified, well, we do falsify it, because if in fact that model is correct, then genetic diversity within a species would increase proportionally to the size of the species. So the bigger the population, the more genetically diverse the species would be. But that does not prove to be the case at all. So it provides, that's a model that provides a falsification test, and it fails it. So what's the explanation here? Is evolution still claiming to explain the origin of the species? Because I don't think it does. I mean, I know it doesn't. And if you want to claim that it does, provide something falsifiable. Provide a way to falsify your claim. Otherwise, you're not really doing science. So accept a definition of species that includes reproductive viability of offspring, or don't claim to be doing science. If you're just saying, well, species is whatever I feel like claiming it is at the moment, and the mechanisms are a mishmash of different things in different times, and we can't really winnow it down to anything specific, and we can't give you anything falsifiable, then you're not doing science. So I'm perfectly happy to accept that evolution does explain everything. It just needs to actually explain it. It can't sit on the sidelines and make a bunch of gestures where it assumes its central claim is true, that it explains the origin of the species, without actually holding any water, providing anything to falsify, or explaining anything. So, yeah, that's the problem. And that's my position on evolution. I'm not making a counter-advocacy. I'm not saying I'm a creationist. I believe that even when we talk about evolution, we can't talk about it without coming into some teleological frame. So we go, well, it served this purpose for the species or the genes. It's like, no, it was evolutionarily advantageous. Which means what exactly? That it served a purpose, therefore it persisted in the species, and if it hadn't, it would have died out. It is true, one of the more powerful mechanisms that evolution has in its favor is the idea of that almost all deleterious mutations are eliminated, are cleaned out of the population right away, because if it's really deleterious, then there are going to be less. Selection works much more effectively on a negative level than it does on a positive level. Negative selection is very effective. If you're born without any legs and arms, chances are you're going to die. So it does prevent genetic decay, I guess you'd say, genome decay, or genome sickliness or something, by eliminating those mutations that aren't good. But that doesn't explain increasing complexity at all. Like, how do species increase in complexity? Genetic drift would appear to provide some explanation to that, but again, that only applies to species when they're in very, very small populations. And the founder effect could explain how some of those populations come to be isolated and therefore define the genome of this species, but it doesn't explain why they're both mutants in the first place, or one of them is a mutant. Aren't they still the same species that they were? So, there are a lot of things a lot of various vectors that evolutionists want to throw in there to say, well, if you add up this and this and this and this, and you add them all together, then maybe it will explain things. Except they don't even know whether they believe it happened gradually over time or in punctuated equilibrium. I think most scientists now are in favor of punctuated equilibrium, but some of them are still phyletic gradualists. So, clearly, this is not a meaningful answer to the question of how we came to be as we are, until I'm convinced otherwise. So go ahead and convince me. Explain to me what I don't understand. I've asked a lot of people this. Nobody's been able to explain to me anything meaningful. If you can't explain anything, stop claiming you explain something. Stop claiming you know how species came to be. Because just because the fossil record suggests it, doesn't mean it's so. We can look at the example of plate tectonics. Originally, the fact that continents were moving apart suggested intuitively the following conclusion. Well, the Earth is expanding like a balloon, causing the continents to move apart from one another. Obviously. Except, it didn't turn out to be right. Some other dude intuited plate tectonics. And everyone's like, oh, you fucking nut job. And that's what it turned out to be. Like 50 years after he died. Everyone's like, oh, he was right. So that's why we shouldn't trust our intuitive leaps. Because we should trust them a lot more when negating than when affirming. I want to stress here, I'm negating evolution. I'm not affirming an alternative. And what I'm negating about it is its central claim that it explains the origin of the species.